Miriam, you think we should get underway?
Yeah, let's rock and roll, Steve. Luke, you good? You ready to start?
Yeah, great. I'll keep letting people in. There's still quite a few coming in, but let's get going.
So let me introduce Miriam, who's the Senior Vice President of Bank of the West and the chair of the ST Learning Consortium. And she's in the middle of a three-way merger between Bank of the West, which is being taken over by Bank of Montreal, and Bank of the West is exiting from Paribas, the French bank. She's in the middle of that, but also collaborating with me on Reinventing Capitalism in her spare time. And we were in Vienna together, and that was fun. And she was here last week, obviously. I'm delighted that she's continuing with us. We also have Luke Joga. He's the head of Hastings Digital, a marketing firm that's been a huge help to me. And he's also responsible for a lot of the success of Rita McGrath and Marshall Goldsmith among the stars. In the first webinar, it was a kind of an overview of the subject of capitalism and what was involved in reimagining it. Today, the plan was to talk about case studies, and then next week we'd go on to planning the transformation journey, and the week after that on pitfalls, risks, and distraction. And then we'd have a book launch in early January. But that schedule has, to some extent, been expanded because we in fact had these two articles, which one was on why Agile needs to take over management itself. And this was something that was sparked by a conversation with Darryl Rigby, the author of Doing Agile Right, and said, wouldn't it be a great idea if we all thought about the predictions we'd made and take a look at the ones that hadn't borne out? And so over the weekend, I actually did that and thought that one of the predictions that I'd made was we would be in an age of Agile within a few years. And I had to confess to myself that we hadn't reached an age of Agile. There were some firms which were very Agile, but overall, big organizations were resisting. I also saw that Agile had a lot of baggage. And so that when you try to persuade big organizations to go Agile, they look at the baggage rather than the idea. And it can, in fact, get in the way of having a constructive discussion. So I said, why don't we stop fighting over Agile? Let's start talking about the real war, which is actually reinventing management, and suggested we do that. And that article, as I say, got more than 57,000 impressions. And I summarized the discussion in yesterday's article, which basically was saying, yes, there is a lot of baggage. Pretty much everyone agreed there's a huge amount of baggage. Not everyone was quite ready to set aside Agile, but everyone agreed that it was a problem. And also that management is a problem. And when we're trying to solve one thing that has a problem with another thing that has a problem, maybe that's too much. So the suggestion was, let's focus on the war and set aside Agile when we're trying to persuade big organizations to change. And Jonas, in the discussions, had the interesting idea, why don't we turn the diagnostic tool that we discussed last week into a manifesto? And he really liked the wording. Instead of doing this, let's do that. And so I, in fact, in the article, cobbled together a draft of a manifesto for digital age management, and we can talk about that later in the group. But the planned agenda for the day was to run through some of the cases, the most prominent cases of firms that are implementing what we were talking about last week. And so there'll be three cases, very well-known firms, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon. We'll talk about three problem cases, GE, IBM, and JP Morgan. We'll also look at some short takes, to have some short takes of a couple of firms. John Deere, which is doing this in agriculture, Alphabet, where are they today? Tesla, and SRI, which we talked a little bit about last week. We have time, we'll also get on to update on Bank of the West from Miriam, and a couple of pharmaceutical firms, Novartis and Roche, and Spotify. And again, if we have time, have a look at a couple of firms that have focused on doing good in the world, of Stakeholder Capitalism, Etsy, and Unilever. So that was the agenda we started with, but we have, in fact, this additional material to discuss. So initial question would be, do you want to discuss any of what we covered last week? Do you want to have initial discussion on the idea of having a manifesto for management? Or do you want to move on to the case studies?
Case studies would be nice.
Okay.
My apologies. I was not here last week.
Mhm.
But I've been in these trenches for a while, and unfortunately, this is so much not about the delivery system, and it's so much about the system that's supporting management as it is currently, right? And unfortunately, it's not the manager's fault, and they're all stuck in the same system. So,
Right.
you know, I'm interested in sharing ideas with each other about how to change this system. The title of your book, Steve, is very provocative, and I love it because I think that's really what needs to happen. But it's just going about doing that, I think, is the challenge.
Yeah. Well, we'll get onto that, and there's a video from last week, and we will have a video this week. So if you miss any of these sessions, don't worry.
Excellent. Thank you.
Able to catch up. And just briefly recapitulate last week, capitalism we defined in this way as an economic system, private ownership, and operation for profit. I think the last point, operation for profit, I think is important. If this is about profit and making money, and sometimes people get embarrassed or that somehow making money is dirty or making a profit is dirty. That is the essence of what this is about, and it's the profit that actually drives the system on, and what has created the huge benefits that we discussed last week that flows from capitalism. We're not going to talk about what government must do, that's in the book, but we're focusing on what firms must do, and these three types of capitalism: shareholder capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, and customer capitalism. That's what this workshop is about. And shareholder capitalism is the idea that the primary purpose of a firm is to make money for the firm itself and its shareholders, maximize shareholder value. And we looked at this schedule that has been going on for a couple of 100 years, but the last 50 years have been an intensification of that. In the previous 200 years, it was about money mattered, but in the last 50 years, money is the only thing that matters, and other things have got crushed in the process. And in a sense, it was making society focused on greed. Greed, for want of a better word, is good, as Michael Douglas says, Gordon Gekko in the movies said the immortal words. That, in a sense, has been the motto of capitalism for the last 50 years, and it's not a good motto, and it's led to huge problems in the economy and a crisis for capitalism itself. And that is the real reason I think we're talking about reinventing capitalism. And the basis has three principles. Making money is at the heart of it. Individuals reporting to bosses, and hierarchical authority, the hierarchy of authority, and having processes that tie all that together. So transactional leadership, strategy focused on basically improving the existing business. Sales is about making sales targets. Budget is a battle of the silos, and HR is about maintaining control. That system is a self-reinforcing system and difficult to change because it is interconnected. The second type of capitalism is stakeholder capitalism, where everything is a priority, and where everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. It's very popular in political circles, but it was tried last century. It didn't work. It's like the Holy Grail. It's politically astute, but as a managerial tool, it's basically doesn't work. Well, you're not going to talk much about that unless you ask questions about it. We're going to focus on, as we did last week, on customer capitalism, the idea that primary purpose of a firm is to create customers. And this really languished for 50 years, but in the last 20 years has become a steadily larger thing. First with Agile, then as software started to eat the world, and then software firms became the most valuable and fastest growing firms in history. And today, most big firms are trying to launch digital transformation. And digital technology hugely accelerated the focus on customers. And the principles are the exact opposite of industrial era, shareholder capitalism. Instead of making money, the focus is giving priority to creating value for customers with a strong business model. Instead of individuals reporting to bosses, work is done in self-organizing teams. Instead of a hierarchy of authority, the firm is a network of competence, the exact opposite of the principles of a 20th century organization. And it, like the 20th century system, has a set of processes that tie that together. And so if you're trying to run an organization in this new way, you also need to change all the processes, strategy, operations, innovation, technology, HR, budget. Everything, in a sense, has to be different in order to get into this new mode. And so you have these two different systems. They are coherent, but they are radically different. They're almost the opposite of each other. And increasingly, the system on the right is a better fit for the economy we have. There may be some parts of the economy where the system on the left makes more sense. Commodities would be one area. Others would argue that there are quite a number of pieces of the corporation that need to be run on the left, and we can argue about that. I tend to think it's a steadily decreasing number of parts of the organization which should be run on the left, but we can talk about that. That's the story so far. So the question is whether you'd like to discuss any of that. That was a recap of last time.
Yeah, I think this is primary point to discuss. The gentleman mentioned earlier how management is in a kind of no-win situation. So to me, the key, because I'm Agile transformation coach, the key is how do you determine value? Now, the values should be determined by the customer, obviously. I think everybody would agree to that. How, now, if the value of a customer, what the customer says valuable changes, the key to me is an agile organization from management down must adopt accordingly. And right now we're in a situation where they create an agile organization, then they stop. Oh, we're agile now. No, you're not, because of the customer's value or the customer want changes, you have to change along with it. I think that's the biggest challenge in the field of agile.
Yeah. When you say that everyone would agree that value is determined by value to the customer, I would tend to argue that many large corporations, maybe most of them, would not agree with that. That they would, in practice, say that short-term shareholder value is what was their description or their view of what is driving and what the organization should be driving at. So you have really at the very top of the organization a division of views as to what is value and what is the organization trying to operate. So what we're looking at in the cases is, well, how did some firms break out of that? How did some firms which were in the old mode, how did they cross that chasm and get to the new? And we'll be looking at some examples of those that did. We'll be looking at examples of those that didn't. And next week, we'll be looking at how to plan the journey in your particular situation.
Before we go on, just one question. Consider, do you believe, is a question, that the business cycle has a lot to do with choosing shareholder value over customer value?
No. When you have a decline in the stock market, as we have now, and you have firms that are particularly software firms that had profited from a zero interest rate environment for almost 15 years, they are falling somewhat sharper than companies which hadn't risen in the first place. But we'll be looking at some of the graphs showing that, in fact, over time, the ranking of firms doesn't change very much. There are some falls, but for a particular reason. But we'll look and see that the firms tend to go and down in the same parallel. For instance, in this next chart, looking at Apple and Microsoft and Amazon, this is the market total return, market capitalization over 5 years. And you'll see that over that 5 years, Apple and Microsoft and Amazon, except for the last month, has been ranked ahead and valued ahead of the S&P 500. And these are seen as growth stocks by the stock market. And both in a rising market and a declining market, they are still ahead. So I would say that it is not affected really by the change, whether the market is rising or falling. But obviously, the particular cases of particular firms may differ, given whether they planned ahead for the change or whether they didn't plan ahead, or maybe overspent on some things and are now suffering from those mistaken judgments. But let's look at some of these cases, these three winning cases. Apple, that's sometimes easy to forget, was basically bankrupt in 1997 and was bailed out by Microsoft. And Steve Jobs was brought back, and he got rid of most of the middle management. He got rid of the R&D department. He said, we can buy R&D from the world, and set about creating a customer-driven firm. He got rid of most of the products. They had 50 computers. 45 of those were set aside. And he said about creating a handful of really top-class computers. And that was really all that he did in the first year or two. And the staff in California were run on the kind of principles we're talking about here. Even though Jobs himself had strong autocratic tendencies, but nevertheless, the structure of the work was very much in teams, and the focus was strongly on the customer. And the physical products were manufactured in China, and they were done on industrial era lines. So it wasn't like the whole firm was run this way. It was only maybe 10% or 15% of the firm was run in this way. The rest was run a very traditional kind of way. And since Steve Jobs' death in 2011, under Tim Cook, the firm has become even more profitable as it's been focusing on digital services. And even without a huge product win like the iPhone. And on all of these cases, that I'll a reference to an article, and you'll be able to download the article, because we'll send you the slides after the presentation, and you can look into these cases more. We're only, in a sense, just sliding over the surface of these firms so that we can have a discussion about it. But obviously, there's a lot more detail and depth that we would need to get into to really understand where Apple is and where it's come from and where it's going. The Microsoft story is one that I'm quite interested in, because I actually visited Microsoft in 2004 and 2015 and 2016 and been in touch with them ever since. And so I've been more involved in the Microsoft story than most of the other ones. I showed you this slide last week, where we had Steve Ballmer era from 2001 to 2014, which was really in the industrial era mode. Confrontational culture, top down, the shareholder is number one, but behind the scenes, other things were happening. Satya Nadella was working in the cloud section of Microsoft and was a fanatic in favor of Agile, he kept saying. And there were other parts in the developer division, which started off with one team, and then 3 teams and 25 teams, and then hundreds of teams operating in a fairly successful Agile mode. And so when Satya Nadella became CEO, it stopped being really, why do we have to do Agile, but rather, how do we get what they're getting? And so these Agile supporters, fanatics came out of the shadows, and they became the new leaders of Microsoft. And many of the old leadership didn't fit this different kind of culture. And so the leadership was able to draw on the staff, the 3,000 or 4,000 Agilists who were in place. And if someone like Steve Ballmer had been appointed as CEO at that point, it seems unlikely that Microsoft has had the extraordinary success that it's had. And Nadella had, as I see it, a 7-point agenda. The first thing he did, which the CEOs rarely do at the start, he killed the losing business models. He said, the Nokia phone, that will never work. Windows will never work as a business. They're dead. And so all of the staff time that would have been spent on that could be freed up to do sensible things. He committed to customer focus, giving primary focus to creating value for customers, and in the context of strong business models. And in the third point, he defined areas of opportunity. People in 2014, writers wrote books explaining why Microsoft was dead and had no future, because all of the areas of opportunity were taken. Obviously, Apple had the phone, Google had search. There was nothing for Microsoft to do except go into a corner and die. But he identified that there were areas of opportunity, that in fact creating value and the use of these of the Apple phone and making use of Google search, he created areas of opportunity where people hadn't been able to see it. And fourthly, he addressed frontally this confrontational culture. He said, we're not going to operate that way from day one. He announced it and he showed it in his behavior, and he kept finding ways to collaborate with staff, with managers, with other companies. The whole dynamic of the firm became one of collaboration. How do we collaborate with people? And of course, many of the existing managers weren't comfortable with that, and they were eased out of the firm. And even more striking was the fifth point, that he made empathy a central point, that they're empathizing with even competitors, trying to understand what's going on in their world and feeling a sense of what would be meaningful in that world. And that was one of the areas that combined with the customer focus, which has been one of the driving successes of Microsoft. As I mentioned, he inspired and unleashed this hidden agile armor that he had. And even more important maybe is that he relentlessly measured customer usage. You couldn't have a meeting with Satya Nadella unless you had the customer usage data. He wasn't interested in the profits, wasn't interested in the amount of sales, wasn't interested in whether you'd met your targets. The only question is, how are customers using what we're doing? But what he did before 2014 was almost as important as these 7 steps, because he had laid the foundation with that army, hidden agile army, where these things could take off like a rocket. So that's the Microsoft story. I think it's a really interesting case. Those 7 steps are a prima facie the kind of steps that a firm that's wanting to transition from one to the other, those are the kind of steps that they need to be considering as primary options. Amazon, we all know, it began life as an online bookstore, late 90s, and from day one, it had a strong customer focus. The hypothesis, as Jeff Bezos said, was that profits would follow as the firm became recognized by customers and investors as a market leader. And like Apple, its management is split between the professional part of the firm, which is run on these digital age principles, and its warehouses, which are mostly run on industrial era principles and robots, actually. But 2 parts of the organization are run on very, very different principles. It's interesting to follow the Amazon story and the book Working Backwards, which is a wonderful book, and I write about it in this article below. They continually improve their way of doing business. They started out thinking, well, we need 2 pizza teams. Every team should be no bigger than and can feed on 2 pizzas, and they morphed into these larger teams where they realized that some of the things done in Amazon were not possible to be done by a 2 pizza team, and so they started having larger teams, which to cope with these larger things. So they had started out with some principles, but they steadily changed in the light of what they found. And the approach of working backwards from the customer is something that evolved steadily over the course of their first 10 or 15 years. And their most profitable business today, where Amazon Web Services didn't exist on day one, and it was built on a suggestion by a staff member the staff member had realized that what they had developed for their own business would be helpful to other organizations, and now it's become a huge, huge organization. So that is the very quick and superficial survey of these three, perhaps the most successful firms operating in this new mode. So let me pause at this point and see, does that resonate? Does that make sense? I know some of you in the room know more about these firms than I do. I'd love to get any suggestions if I'm misstating the picture. Obviously, there's much I haven't talked about, but is it overall roughly correct?
Well, these examples are quite known in the market and as of course a best practice and the way we change the culture of the companies. Unfortunately, in the general market itself, we don't see the management teams so much interesting in changing the culture and get out of the focus of generating money to be distributed by their shareholders. So what is missing? Exactly why people are not adhering to this? What is still missing in this context?
Well, we will go on discussing this through the webinar series, but part of it is a view that greed is good. We, as a society, particularly in America, started to believe that if we looked after the shareholders, the company, the executives, and focused everything on them, then everything would follow, all the benefits would flow from the rest of the organization and for society. And what we didn't realize as a society, that if we did that, it would lead inexorably to a focus on the short term, and it would require bureaucracy to run it. And so long as that set of values remains in place, then nothing will change. The irony is that when firms adopt this new way of operating and shift from the focus of making money to actually creating value for customers, they make more money than the firms that are still focused on making money for themselves. So it's an irony, and it's not often talked about. I mean, I was really struck, say, the Drucker Forum conference, where you have all of the big thinkers supposedly about management gathered together in one place, and this issue was not even hardly mentioned. I mean, it was touched on by one or two speakers in passing, but it wasn't discussed as the central issue, which is getting in the way of pretty much all progress in management. And there was, in the articles I wrote about that conference, suggesting that, in fact, management as a discipline has not advanced, in part because of this. And I challenged people like Amy Edmondson, and she agreed, and has now come out with a statement that there is nothing more important than reinventing and reimagining capitalism. And so we're starting to see some of the thought leaders raise these issues and say, look, this is unacceptable. This is intolerable to have a society which is run where greed is considered as good. We have to say that that is not a sound principle. We have to have a society where business is run on creating value for customers and making profits, sure, but it should be focused on creating value for customers as the primary target of the firm. But we will continue to discuss this question, and I think that the picture is more promising than the state. And what we have been discussing amongst some of the people who I'm with is that there are, most of these firms, there are pockets in the top echelon of senior leaders who know this is wrong, who know it needs to change, who are working to make it happen. And in fact, we organized a conference in September and had one or two of these leaders, particularly Bill Anderson of Roche Pharmaceuticals. And I'll share the video of his presentation where you have someone at the top who's realized that this is a wrong way to run the firm and is taking drastic steps to introduce change and start to emulate those three winners that I just mentioned. That's a long answer to a rather difficult question, and we'll go on discussing it because it is the heart of the matter.
Steve, I have a observation there. I'm working at I'm coming out of the world that you're describing here. I worked for Microsoft many years, have insights into Amazon. And I'm currently working in a chemical firm. And I am, for the first time ever, they run products that have been in the market since 100 years. And the need to change for them is minimal, right? And I'm really struggling with that question, right? And I'm wondering whether we could look at companies who manage turnaround, right? Who basically, like one firm that comes to mind is Nokia. I mean, I think started with rubber boots, and they were a leader for mobiles for a long while. So they did something right. They managed to turn this around. And I'm wondering whether the properties you're describing for the capitalism are helping a firm, whether that's the purpose, helping a firm to continuously reinvent themselves in order to survive. Where there's on the other firms who are not doing this are opposed to basically die when the market of the products go by because they're not able to reinventing themselves. So I'm wondering whether it makes sense to do that sort of asset tests, apply these properties to firms and saying, hey, what can we learn from firms who manage turnarounds? I mean, also Microsoft, for example, evolved. It became from an on-premise IT company to a cloud company. Right, and continuously when it faced challenges and learned from its competitors, it was able to face it, like dealing with security problems, winning the browser wars, and all these types in the history. Right, just some thoughts.
Yeah, well, we have an ally in this matter, which is the stock market, which is dealing with these firms which are stuck in the past, and they are regarded at best as cash cows. They are not valued highly. They are, in fact, regarded rather lowly, and the increasing pressure is then put on those firms to do something and to get into a more productive mode. So that is one huge source of pressure. Now, it is possible that these firms have at their disposal a whole set of financial gadgets that can prolong their life long after they should have moved on. Share buybacks, one popular thing, adjusting, moving profits around. They can give an illusion of profits, but they can't do that for many years. And so that's why I tend to look at the long-term growth or decline of market capitalization as an indication of whether these are firms that are on the up and up or whether they are firms in decline. And in fact, we'll look at a couple of the firms that did, as you suggest, just soldiering on with more of the same and focusing on their shareholder value. And they have all done much worse than the S&P 500. So GE, IBM, and JP Morgan. All well below the S&P 500. They are treated as cash cows, and growth stocks eventually put cash cows out of business. And they start out by being more highly valued, and then they start intruding in the businesses of these cash cows, and eventually, sooner if not later, then the cash cows will die. So General Electric was one of these. It was the largest and most profitable firm in the 20th century. Jack Welch, CEO, and it epitomized the principles of industrial era management. Jeff Immelt took over in 2001 and continued this focus. He talked a lot about innovation as a process, and he invested billions and billions in digital technology, but didn't get really strong returns from those investments. I actually visited GE Health back in 2012, and it was an amazing experience because that was a hotspot of Agile. This was about a fifth of GE overall. And the whole of GE Health was an army of Agilists, exactly as I saw in Microsoft. But they couldn't get the ear of the top management of GE. In fact, they saw themselves as a sleeper cell, an Agile sleeper cell within GE, trying to get GE to change. And so they were trying to get my support to do that. But they were very successful. GE Health was the most successful parts of GE, but GE wasn't interested in Agile. It was interested in running the firm exactly the way it was. And things then started to come unstuck. In the financial crisis of 2008, it turned out that GE depended totally on its finance sector and had to be bailed out by the US government. It would have gone under without that. In 2011, even Jack Welch said that this was the dumbest idea in the world that they were pursuing. And in 2015, finally the game was up, and Immelt and his team were fired, and critics labeled GE as practicing innovation theater. So you can carry on that kind of thing for 10, 15, 20 years, but ultimately things catch up with you. And now it's being split into 3 separate firms, and GE Health is as I say, one of the most productive of those 3 elements. Interestingly, GE Appliances couldn't make a profit as part of GE under this regime. It was sold to Haier in China in 2016. And Haier has a philosophy of zero distance from the customer and intense customer focus. And lo and behold, GE Appliances is now doing well and making a profit and undertaking real innovation. So leadership makes a huge difference. Here was this division of GE under GE in the old way, a dead loss, really, a dead weight on GE. Suddenly, when you have the right context, it becomes a completely different animal. So this is about changing the context so that it wasn't that they had the wrong staff, it wasn't they lacked skills, it wasn't that they didn't have resources, they had the wrong management. They were using wrong management for the 21st century. IBM, it's a bit of a similar kind of story. Under Sam Parmisano from 2000 to 2012, and Gini Rometty from 2012 to 2020, they were the champions of maximizing shareholder value. That was the secret. That was going to solve the problems of the world. And in the process, IBM steadily lost ground. Parmisano outsourced a lot of work to cheaper talent. And I attended some of the Agile implementations. They were kind of doing the thing that GE Health was. They were saying, look, we're trying to create a different sort of environment and in opposition to what the management is doing, but they were very pessimistic about whether it would actually take effect, whereas GE Health was hugely optimistic that they were on the track to success. And in fact, those Agile implementations in IBM were crushed. The people involved in them were terminated, and so they disappeared. And the result was IBM's steady decline. They've got a new CEO now. It's unclear to me actually where they're heading. And the article below, how IBM could become a digital winner, suggests a set of steps that they could go about if they really wanted to get into the success of the 21st century. Different kind of case is JP Morgan, which is one of the biggest banks. It's a successful bank. It makes a lot of money. It's worth about $400 billion. But Jamie Dimon is unhappy because his firm is valued at $400 billion and Apple is valued at 6 or 7 or 8 times that. So here's why is Apple and Microsoft, why are these firms valued so highly when I'm valued even lower than the S&P 500? And so earlier this year, in January, he announced that he is going to become a digital firm, that JP Morgan is going to spend billions on setting up a digital banking system in UK. And he had problems with meetings with investors who started saying, well, tell us what is the game plan? What are you actually going to accomplish with this digital banking? And the meetings kept going on until I think it was in May, where he held a day-long conference where he brought in all his top staff and himself, and they spent a day trying to explain what these huge investments in digital technology would accomplish. And at the end of it, basically Wall Street, the investors said, we still don't see what you're actually going to accomplish with this. You're buying all this technology, you're buying all these staff, and you're spending billions. But how will JP Morgan's digital banking differ from existing banking in UK? I mean, they already have banks. They already have digital access to banking. What are you going to offer that they don't already have? And because at the end of the conference, JP Morgan is a very sort of strongly outspoken kind of person. Said, well, we've told you what we're doing, and if you listen to what we're saying, you would understand what we're doing. But as you can see, it made absolutely no difference on the stock price. The Wall Street continues to have questions. We don't understand what you're spending all this money on and what it will accomplish, because you haven't really understood what the customer needs that they're not currently getting. And until you do that, you can waste huge amounts in digital technology and staff doing things that don't add any value to the customer or to the firm. So there are many, many cases of that for these digital transformations where they're trying to implement it with industrial era management, where the customer is not central, and having internal processes. All of the processes we described at the start of the meeting, they don't work with digital. So that is a warning, I feel like, for many firms undertaking digital transformation.